Hello everyone, I hope this video finds all of you well. First of all, I want to tell you guys what happened with me. Normally I would keep this kind of stuff private, but I just think it's kind of a little bit odd that while I did cut it out of the video, I had talked about the fact that Quicksand Slip turned 29 last week, a week ago from today, and that we weren't promised tomorrow, so that I was going to go on to celebrate it now rather than celebrate the 30-year anniversary. And then as I was editing this video and just about to upload it to YouTube, I suffered a heart attack. I'm okay for now. Sometimes I feel a little bit ghostly. I feel like I'm not really here. But I just want to give you guys this video to let you know how important this album is to me and how I feel like it's a treasure in my collection of music. You cannot have bands like Deftones without Quicksand. And many more. You can't even have At the Drive-In without Quicksand. There's just so much influence, and there's so much that Quicksand and even bands like Fugazi, there was something that these bands did that was very, very special. And I don't think that, we know that it won't be ever reproduced again. I mean, especially coming out of what I felt was the best decade in music. I'm sorry, I know some people get offended when I say this, but I think that the 80s was the last decade of original music where anything went, and there was just something very special about that decade. With bands like Quicksand, they really made the 90s valid in a way, in my opinion. Like I said, there's so much great music that came out in the 90s, don't get me wrong. Hello, Nirvana, right? But there's a lot of good music that came out, but there were a lot of bands that just fell by the wayside. They just didn't get the proper recognition. They were terribly, terribly underrated. And Quicksand is one of those bands. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. I'm looking forward to being able to revisit this later and talk about it once it turns 30. But for now, here are my thoughts covering Quicksand's 1993 release, Slip. Today, I want to talk about what I feel is hands down one of the most unique and cutting edge albums in my music collection, Quicksand Slip. Released on this day, February 9th, 1993. When I heard about this band, it was right around the time that I discovered bands like Rage Against the Machine and even 311. But there's something about Quicksand that was different than the other bands I mentioned. Also, I guess 93 was the year I discovered Tool. There was like this new wave of aggressive music that was coming around, and it was a little bit more cutting edge. It was fresh to the ears in a way at the time, coming off of listening to a great deal of hardcore and metal and thrash metal, punk. Something about Quicksand, it's different. There's just something about their sound, everything they do, musically and their vocals especially, that makes them stand out from all of their contemporaries at that time. So I wanted to get into that album and discuss it since today is the 29-year anniversary of the release of that album. I still remember the first time that I heard Quicksand. I had been hearing about them, and I had seen their posters around, like at the clubs that I would go to see other bands, or even places where I would play. There'd be Quicksand posters up. People were making a pretty big deal about them in the underground music scene when they first came around. I was in what would end up becoming my first apartment. The day that I came into that apartment, he was playing Quicksand, and I was like, oh my God, what is this? Like, immediately, I can think of times in my life where I've heard music and just certain bands, you hear a particular recording from them and you're paralyzed because it's so captivating and you can't even move because you're just like, wow. And Slip definitely did that to me. There's just something about this album. I can listen to it over and over and over. This is one of the few albums in my collection that when I listen to it, I don't listen to it once and move on to another album. I typically will run through it at least a minimum of 3 times before I even consider moving on to something else. I might even leave it on repeat for days. I mean, that's what this album means to me. There are a few other bands that I'd love to mention. Another band that did this to me and just had me hooked is this band, Voivod. This album, Nothing Face, is hands down another one of the most infectious albums in my collection. I can listen to Nothing Face for a week straight and not get tired. It is some of the most amazing music I've ever heard in my life. I love it. And the same thing goes for this one here. I cannot let this video go without mentioning XTC. And believe it or not, here's someone you probably never heard of, 24/7 Spies, Harder Than You. Another album that still to this day, even after all these years, over 30 years since I've listened to this music, I still love it today. I mean, it's insane. It's such great music. We're gonna get into Quicksand Slip right now. I'm gonna go over some of my favorite tracks on this album. I'm gonna go over some of the bass lines and talk about the guitar style, the vocal style, which is just so infectious. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Songs, or a few of them, start with the bass, and he's always doing these rhythmic things that are really catchy. Listen. Another thing that I love so much about Walter's vocals is he almost has this almost military-esque kind of chant to his vocals. So when he does things like, down on the downside, I'm falling down on the downside, built on a weak spot, facts hiding in your mind, waiting on the fire. Okay, pun intended, but this is another album that I just kept playing over and over and over again. Fugazi's Repeater. This album is very important to the story of Quicksand because in a strange way, this sort of influenced Quicksand a bit. There's just something about what was happening at the time, like coming out of the late 80s into the early 90s with the whole grunge thing taking off, and then metal just kind of dissolving a little bit and kind of reinventing itself. Well, the whole hardcore scene had also kind of died out, and this post-hardcore thing was happening with bands like, you know, Embrace for one, but then which led to Fugazi, and then you have like Quicksand and Helmet and so many other bands. Just wanted to mention this album because this was another really important album to me in my youth when I was making that transition from being really heavily into metal and then crossing over. Speaking of crossing over, but a lot of bands were doing this crossover thing where they were meshing hardcore and punk, like bands like Sick of It All, Agnostic Front, things like that were taking their course, running their course, and then the early 90s hit, so then you started seeing these bands, like I said, once again, like Quicksand, Tool, Rollins' band was doing some different things. Something was happening, and there was this hip-hop influence that was getting into metal and hardcore, and it was really creating something new. And what really killed me is, like, there were some great shows. Like, I had just caught Rage Against the Machine just before discovering Quicksand, and I saw them open up for House of Pain. I went to the show just to see Rage Against the Machine because I'd been hearing about them, and I was just completely blown away. They had not even released their album yet. It wasn't even out, the first Rage Against the Machine record. It wasn't out. They were handing out these cassette tapes at the show, which I still have. Something new was happening. Even bands like 311, which, you know, now maybe to some people they would laugh, but 311, they were really taken off. Like, it really came down to, and there were other bands before these bands that were kind of going in that direction, but they weren't executing it well. Mordred being one of those bands. Nothing against Mordred. We were really digging on Mordred, but they just didn't age well. Now when you go back and listen to, I think it's In This Life or whatever, it just doesn't hold up, unfortunately. But it was still an important album. It led to things. And people were just crossing a lot of styles, like Wrathchild America with the 3D album. And just things were happening. And like I said, on the forefront of all that, bands that were really taking off in the underground scene, Fugazi, Quicksand, Rage Against the Machine, 311, these bands were crossing those genres of like hip hop and metal, and in a different way though. And I'm so glad that I got to be there to see a lot of it. Unfortunately, I missed out Rage Against the Machine and Quicksand. Now, I'd already seen Rage Against the Machine, but that was the show that we were so pumped up to see. And then Tom Morello broke his leg, so they missed the night in Atlanta and then resumed the tour right after Atlanta, which just ate me alive. But it is what it is. I finally got to see them about 4 years ago, since I finally got to see Quicksand after all this time. Failure was another one of those bands that I wanted to mention because I feel like they were an important piece to that whole puzzle as well. And Failure also toured with Quicksand not too long ago, and I missed out on that. And that really bothered me because I still have not seen Failure live. I will talk about them more later. Hopefully I'll get to see them live soon. But anyway, listen, I'm gonna have to wrap this video up because it's been a super long, busy day, a lot of family stuff. Hopefully I will be able to revisit this on the 30-year anniversary and do the review a lot more justice. But until then, thank you for watching. Quicksand's debut album, Slip, is a masterpiece. It has deservedly gained a massive cult following over the past 3 decades. Without going off on another tangent, I can only think of a small number of bands that have rivaled this achievement out of the gate. Alan Cage, Tom Capone, Walter Schreifels, and Sergio Vega made contributions to this album that cannot be understated. They walk a tightrope over hardcore, metal, and hip-hop without being completely pinned to any of the genres, all while maintaining a groove that is so infectious you are hooked by the first 8 bars of the album. If you know of a band with a debut album as strong as Quicksand's debut, please mention that album in the comments section. One of my favorite pastimes is to discuss music. Thanks for watching and take care. I'll have another video out for you sooner than later.